So hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Dr. Weir, for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. I actually did participate in the Summer Institutes probably in 2007 and 2008. So it's been a long time, but it's really great to be back. So I'm currently at University of California, Los Angeles, and I first want to just start by recognizing that UCLA is on the homelands of the Tongva people, who are the caretakers of what's called a Tongva in the Los Angeles basin. So today I want to talk about a couple of different perspectives that Indigenous peoples have on genetic research. And I myself am Indigenous. I'm from the Navajo tribe in Arizona. And I actually started off as a geneticist and became very interested in bioethics and policy related questions that have come up in the context of thinking about why Indigenous people have not really been participating in genetic research. I was very interested in understanding people's perspectives, and that has led me to some more recent work where I'm focusing on developing Indigenous genetic research policies that are relevant to tribal nations and Indigenous peoples, but also can be applied to a lot of other populations. So I hope that what I'll share today will, you can be able to take some of the lessons learned from some of these different studies that I've either followed or have been engaged in to think about why it's important to think about engagement in multiple different ways. So although my slides won't show it, and I'm happy to share my slides afterwards, I generally start off by talking about how Indigenous peoples are very underrepresented in genetic research studies. And so there was a paper published by Alice Pope-Joy and Malia Fullerton in 2016 in Nature, which shows that the representation of people has changed over time in genome-wide association studies. So in 2009, Esteban Burchard, Carlos Bustamante, and others looked at how the representation looked in 2009 and showed that 96% of all genome-wide association studies included people of European ancestry. And in 2016, when Pope-Joy and Fullerton updated those results, they found that 81% of all genome-wide association studies included people of European ancestry. When you break down the representation of people who are not of European ancestry, those percentages of Indigenous peoples has actually gone down from 0.06% to 0.05%. And more recent studies have indicated that those numbers are probably even lower. So I have been particularly concerned about that. And in the course of my research, and also based on empirical research and also anecdotal evidence, I think that some of the reasons for lack of representation in research include things like historical mistrust, perceived lack of benefits, challenges that are concerns that interpretation of different types of results challenge a person's cultural perceptions about who they are or their personal norms about where they are and where they come from. There's also an alternative commitment to other types of health priorities that are not focused on genetics. And then more recently, there's been a lot of concerns over lack of control over secondary uses of data. So if we can go to the 5th slide, thank you so much for bringing those up. The previous slide.
Number 5.
Got it.
So in the 1990s, the Havasupai tribe in Arizona actually embarked on a genetic research study with investigators from Arizona State University. And they were very interested in understanding why their tribe had such high rates of type 2 diabetes. And the investigators at Arizona State conducted an informed consent process that actually used a very broad informed consent form that indicated that they were looking at behavioral and medical problems. Blood samples were collected from over 400 tribal members. And next slide. Thanks. And the investigators could not find any conclusive results indicating that diabetes was linked to any particular gene or genetic variant. And so the investigators, not surprisingly, shared their samples with other researchers, which was actually kind of a common thing back then, where investigators were often sharing their resources with other investigators to study a whole host of different issues and problems and conditions. These samples ended up being used in studies on schizophrenia, inbreeding, and migration studies. The tribe sued the researchers over misuse of these samples, and they were concerned about schizophrenia because there was no evidence that schizophrenia even existed in their tribe. They were concerned about inbreeding and migration because with inbreeding, there were studies looking at the inbreeding coefficient of how similar people within the tribe were to each other compared to people outside of their tribe. And then migration was also a concern because the Havasupai have their own narrative about where they come from and how they got to the lands where they are today. And that conflicts with the scientific evidence that indicates that people in the Americas came over the Bering Strait. And so they were concerned about these narratives that were very different from their own. The tribe sued the researchers, and it caught a lot of media attention. The case was actually not settled. The case was actually settled out of court. So there was no judge ruling, there was no legal precedent. But this actually raised a lot of different concerns for a lot of investigators about what it means to obtain informed consent. One of the things that was very noteworthy of this case was that the DNA samples were returned to the Havasupai tribe, and so they were able to take those samples home and dispose of them in a appropriate way using ceremonies that their tribe deemed appropriate. So next slide. Also around that time, and not related to the Havasupai case per se, were other types of discussions going on in other indigenous groups. For example, the Navajo Nation had discussions over whether or not to allow genetic research to take place. These discussions happened before the Havasupai tribe case started. There were concerns that were raised by the Navajo Nation about possible stigmatization, biased interpretation, and lack of benefit. And the Navajo Nation has an IRB that reviews all research protocols, but there was also a recognition that there were no policies or guidance in place at the time. And so they passed a moratorium on genetic research studies in 2002. That moratorium is actually still in place. I think part of the reason why it's still in place is because of the Havasupai tribe's lawsuit. So for many years, the Navajo Nation did not want to go back and address the moratorium that was in place. Similarly, in 2003, Native Hawaiian people protested against the University of Hawaii researchers who wanted to sequence and patent the Native Hawaiian genome, and they also had been protesting some proposals to genetically modify the taro plant. The taro plant is actually very sacred to the Native Hawaiian people and is a major food source, but there's also a lot of cultural beliefs tied into what the significance of a taro plant. So there were protests to halt the research, and at that time, a 5-year moratorium on genetic research was also passed by the Native Hawaiian people. So next slide. So against this backdrop of different ways that people were halting genetic research, I was really interested in understanding what people's perspectives were on genetic research in the US today. So I started a study to characterize the views of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian stakeholders to understand their perspectives around genetics and also their perspectives around genomic data sharing. So next slide. So I conducted a study, and we have a paper that was published a couple of months ago in Ethnicity and Disease, if you want to go take a look at that in more detail. We interviewed people who identified as tribal leaders, health professionals, and policy experts from these indigenous groups in the US, and we were very interested in understanding what their perspectives were on genetic research. So I won't go through this table, but this kind of gives you an indication of who these people were that we've interviewed. Next slide. So genomic data sharing, I'm assuming that many of you already know what genomic data sharing is, but the idea here is to promote robust sharing of human and non-human data from a wide range of genetic research and genomic research. And NIH has a genomic data sharing policy that applies to all NIH-funded projects that generate large-scale genomic data. And it also stipulates that any submission of data needs to be consistent with tribal laws and policies. What a lot of people don't really fully realize is that tribes can actually opt out of data sharing as long as they have appropriate agreements in place, like more memorandums of agreements or other types of agreements. And so given that tribes do have the sovereign ability to opt out of certain types of data sharing, I was very interested in understanding what people thought about data sharing too. So next slide. So the study that I conducted was a qualitative study that really focused on interviews. And so I'm showing a couple of different quotes here, and I won't go through them all in detail, but you feel free to take a look later. But what I wanted to just illustrate here is that there is a whole range of what people think should happen with data sharing after research ends. Some people believe that tribes should share data. For example, one said as long as there are assurances in place and that the data are de-identified. Others thought that tribes should decide for themselves, that they shouldn't necessarily be influenced by policies, but they should decide whether or not it's right for them. So some people said that I would encourage it, but I would never impose it on another tribe. And other people were actually against the idea of data sharing. And one investigator had said that they had made sure that none of their projects that they've conducted in partnership with tribes has ever placed into NIH or federally sponsored repositories. Next slide. And also thinking about oversight. This is actually an interesting one because tribes have the sovereign ability to govern themselves, and with that comes presumed oversight, but there's also some technical issues over who really has the ability to oversee data, who has the infrastructures in place, and so forth. So there was a range of views here too, where some people thought that tribes should have oversight of their data, that it should never be the academic partner or the research partner in a perfect world. But other people that I interviewed also recognized that for practical purposes, the data should be protected and controlled by the researcher or the research institution. And it should be based upon an agreed upon consent process by the tribe. When I pressed it a little further, some people also revealed that they thought that some tribes don't have the technical capacities in place or the specific scientific expertise or the computing infrastructure to oversee certain types of data that are coming from their tribe. So that poses a huge amount of challenges that people are facing. So next slide.
Excuse me, Nanibaa, we're going to lose our link in the 2 or 3 minutes. So just without confusion at the beginning, we're running out. So
no worries.
You're fine for about 8 minutes.
Let's go ahead and skip to slide 16. One of the things that I would like to share really quickly is that I along with a group of Indigenous investigators, came up with a framework for thinking about enhancing genomic research with Indigenous peoples. And this is a paper that was published in Nature Communications in 2018 that really thinks about multiple different components about what it would take to conduct ethical genetic research. Thinking about multiple different components that are built around tribal sovereignty, community engagement, concepts around bioethics, and also concepts around community engaged research. And so I would really encourage people to take a look at this paper and read through what we mean by this. But this is a framework that we developed to really, that we hope to really hone in on what it means to do ethics right, to do genetics right. We've received a lot of feedback from a lot of different groups who have said they really like this representation and how it shows that everything is related. Everything from making sure that people who you engage with have cultural competency to engage with the group that they're working with, that there's transparency in how the research is conducted, that there's capacity building to help people from the community begin to be involved in genetic research or other types of research, and dissemination. I think that this framework can also be applied to many different groups, not just Indigenous groups, and it can be applied to other types of research, not just genetic research. So next slide. So basically, just to conclude really quickly, and I'm sorry that we had to cut this short, but as you've seen, there's a lot of different perspectives around genetic research. Research studies can inform community needs and help to develop data-driven policies. There's a lot of collaborations that are rewarding, but this can also be producing products that are beneficial to a wide range of people. And then next slide. And then I just want to conclude by acknowledging the wide range of people who have helped me with a lot of this work. Under collaborators, what I didn't get to was the SING Consortium, which is a summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genetics. And it was through that consortium that we developed the framework that I just shared briefly. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'm happy to share my slides and any other resources that people are interested in.
Thank you, Nanibaa. That was exactly what I was hoping you could do. Just tell us the story, because it's very important. We're just about out of time. If there's a quick question on the chat, you could post it. Otherwise, I'm sure you can find Nanibaa's email. Just Google Nanibaa Garrison, UCLA, and she'll pop right up.
It's also on the first page of the first slide.
Yes, right. So the slides will be available, as will a recording of this talk. So it'll be on the biostat webpage at some point soon, we hope. And we just got a thank you from Lily Pennington. Thank you, Dr. Garrison, for a wonderful talk. And I certainly agree with that. So I'm going to thank you very much, Anderson. A quick question from Stephanie Gogarden. Can you see that, Nanibaa?
Yes.
Yeah, just go ahead.
So any thoughts or readings on genetic research studies with non-tribal affiliated people with some Indigenous ancestry? Yeah, so there's actually, I think it depends on exactly what you're looking for. If you're interested in stuff like community-based research, there's a lot of resources on that. Some people are also interested in genetic ancestry testing. There's a lot of controversy about what that really means and how that can be helpful to different people, depending on how much Indigenous ancestry a person has and the purposes for seeking that out. The All of Us research program has a recent statement about not using data from anyone who claimed Native ancestry. There's some controversy around that too, because some people believe that Indigenous people should be included in these types of research. They just want it to be done right. And so the All of Us program actually proceeded to recruit Indigenous peoples without doing tribal consultation, and that actually raised a lot of concerns about whether or not it was appropriate to recruit Indigenous peoples from urban settings where they were not subject to tribal sovereignty laws. So there's some controversy around that. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily been resolved, but there are some investigators who are looking at what the impact of urban recruitment might look like for Indigenous peoples. I'm not sure how much time I have to get into more detail.
I think we should probably stop now, so you can follow up. So thank you, Stephanie, for the question, and thank you very much, Nanibaa. That was wonderful, and we've got you captured now. And hopefully next year we'll have you here in person.
I hope so too.
All right, thank you, everybody.